Imagine moving into your dream home, excited to start a new chapter, only to have someone knock on your door, demanding you repaint your fence, all because it doesn't match their perfect community standards. What would you do? I'm Elizabeth. I'm a 40-year-old woman who's always dreamt of living in a peaceful neighborhood where I could finally call a house my own. After years of hard work, my husband and I managed to move into a beautiful suburban community that seemed straight out of a magazine. Wide streets lined with trees, friendly neighbors waving at each other, and homes that looked like they belonged in a picture-perfect postcard. It felt like we'd finally made it. One of the first things I wanted to do was add a personal touch to our home. You see, I've always been someone who loves creating a space that feels warm and inviting. So after settling in, I decided to install a charming white picket fence around the yard. To me, it was more than just a fence. It was a symbol of our hard work and the cozy life I envisioned for my family. It complemented the house beautifully, and honestly, I thought the neighbors would love it too. But as they say, not everyone sees the world through the same lens. The fence went up within a week of us moving in, and I was overjoyed. It stood tall and pristine, its crisp white paint gleaming under the morning sun. My kids even started calling it Mom's masterpiece because I was so obsessed with how it tied the whole yard together. Neighbors walked by, complimenting the work and sharing how nice it looked. At least, that's what most of them said. A few days later, the doorbell rang. Standing there, clipboard in hand, was the HOA president. Let's call her Susan. "Hi, I'm Susan," she said, flashing a tight smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "I'm the president of the Homeowners Association here. Welcome to the neighborhood." At first, I thought she was there to introduce herself, maybe even bring a welcome basket like I'd seen in movies. Instead, Susan's gaze shifted to the fence, and her expression hardened. "About your fence," she started, pointing her pen at it. "It's not in compliance with our community's approved color palette. All fences in this neighborhood must be beige or taupe. White. Well, white doesn't align with our guidelines." I stood there, blinking, trying to process what she was saying. "Wait," I said, trying to keep my tone polite. "So you're saying the color of my fence is a problem?" Susan nodded, her lips pursed. "Exactly. I'm sure it was an honest mistake, but I'll need you to repaint it within 14 days to avoid any penalties. Let me tell you, I've faced my fair share of challenges in life, but being told to repaint a perfectly good fence because someone didn't like the color, that was a new one." I took a deep breath. "Susan, I understand there are rules, but I wasn't aware of this color requirement when we moved in. Isn't white a neutral and classic choice?" Her smile grew tighter. "I'm afraid it's not about what's classic or neutral. It's about maintaining a uniform aesthetic. These rules ensure property values remain high. It's all outlined in the HOA handbook." Now, here's the thing. I'd glanced through that handbook when we moved in, but nowhere did I remember seeing a section about mandatory fence colors. Still, I wasn't about to argue on the spot. "All right," I said. "Thank you for letting me know. I'll look into it." Susan seemed satisfied with that answer and left. But as soon as the door closed, I felt a mix of emotions: frustration, confusion, and yes, even a bit of amusement. Was this really happening? That evening, I pulled out the HOA handbook and flipped through it. Pages of fine print detailing everything from lawn care to acceptable mailbox styles. And finally, there it was, a section on fence guidelines. Sure enough, it mentioned the color palette: beige, taupe, or approved alternatives. White wasn't listed, but here the splatter stood out to me. The word "recommended" appeared multiple times. Nowhere did it explicitly say "required." This felt less like a rule and more like a suggestion. Feeling a bit more confident, I decided to sleep on it. Maybe I'd missed something, or perhaps there was room for discussion. After all, I wasn't trying to break any rules. I just wanted my home to feel like home. The next morning, I woke up to find a formal letter slipped under my door. It was from Susan, reiterating her point about the fence and the 14-day deadline. This time, though, she'd added a threat. Failure to comply may result in fines of up to $50 per day. $50 per day? For a fence color? This was starting to feel personal. I decided it was time to have a proper conversation. Later that afternoon, I walked over to Susan's house, determined to resolve this amicably. She greeted me with the same tight smile and invited me in. As we sat down, I explained my perspective. "Susan, I've gone through the handbook, and I noticed that the color palette is described as recommended. I just want to make sure we're interpreting this correctly," I said, keeping my tone calm but firm. Her expression didn't change. "The board considers it mandatory," she replied. "We've enforced it consistently to maintain our community's appearance." "Has anyone ever challenged this before?" I asked. Susan hesitated for a moment. "Not successfully," she said. avoiding eye contact. That was all the encouragement I needed. It was clear that this rule wasn't as ironclad as she wanted me to believe. Armed with what I had discovered, I knew my next move had to be both strategic and deliberate. The last thing I wanted was to come off as confrontational, but I also couldn't let Susan's vague threats go unchecked. That evening, I sat down with my husband to share everything that had happened so far. He listened patiently, occasionally nodding as I detailed my interaction with Susan and the contents of the handbook. "You're right," he finally said. "It doesn't sound like she has a strong case, but you know how these things go. Sometimes it's less about the rules and more about who's enforcing them." I nodded, fully understanding what he meant. HOA presidents like Susan often seem to operate on their own interpretations of the rules, relying on the fact that most homeowners wouldn't bother to push back. But I wasn't most homeowners. The next day, I decided to take a closer look at the community's history with HOA disputes. If Susan's claim that no one had successfully challenged the board was true, I needed to understand why. Was it because no one had tried? Or had the board managed to intimidate anyone who did? I started by chatting with a few of my neighbors. Most of them were friendly and open, happy to share their experiences with the HOA. As it turned out, Susan had been the president for over 5 years, and during that time, she'd developed a bit of a reputation. Some described her as meticulous, while others were less kind, using words like pushy and controlling. One neighbor, a retired teacher named Mrs. Patel, told me about her own run-in with Susan. "A couple of years ago, I planted some roses in my front yard," she said, shaking her head. "Susan claimed they were too bright and didn't match the neighborhood's natural color scheme. She threatened to fine me, but I stood." After hearing Mrs. Patel's story and several others, I realized I wasn't alone in my frustration. Susan had a pattern of targeting homeowners over trivial issues, often twisting vague rules to her advantage. While some neighbors had complied to avoid confrontation, others had fought back, only to eventually give up due to the stress of dealing with endless letters and threats. But unlike those who had given in, I felt more determined than ever to stand my ground. My fence wasn't just about aesthetics anymore. It had become a symbol of my right to create a home that reflected who I was. With this newfound determination, I decided to take my concerns to the next HOA meeting. I marked the date on my calendar and spent the days leading up to it gathering as much information as I could. I reviewed the handbook again, taking detailed notes on anything that could support my case. I even consulted a local lawyer who specialized in HOA disputes. She confirmed what I had suspected. Susan's interpretation of the rules was questionable at best. "She can't enforce a fine unless the rule is clearly stated and approved by the board," the lawyer explained. "If the handbook uses words like recommended, it's not legally binding." This reassurance gave me the confidence I needed to prepare for the meeting. I drafted a short but persuasive speech, outlining my points and questioning the enforcement of these so-called rules. My goal wasn't just to defend my fence. It was to hold the HOA accountable and encourage other homeowners to speak up. The night of the meeting arrived, and the room was packed. It seemed word had spread about my dispute with Susan, and many neighbors had shown up out of curiosity, or perhaps solidarity. Susan sat at the front of the room, her usual clipboard in hand, flanked by a few other board members. She greeted the crowd with her signature tight smile, but I could sense the tension in her demeanor. After the usual agenda items were addressed, it was time for the open forum. I stood up, heart pounding but head held high. "Hi everyone," I began, glancing around the room. "For those of you who don't know me, I'm Hira, and my family and I moved here recently. I wanted to take this opportunity to address an issue that I believe concerns not just me, but all of us as homeowners." I explained my situation, detailing Susan's demands and the vague wording of the handbook. As I spoke, I could see nods of agreement from some of the neighbors, while others whispered among themselves. When I finished, I posed a question that seemed to resonate with the room. Shouldn't we, as a community, have a say in what these rules mean and how they're enforced? After all, this is our neighborhood. Susan, clearly uncomfortable, attempted to regain control of the conversation. "Thank you for sharing, Elizabeth," she said, her voice clipped. "However, the board's decisions are made in the best interest of the community. If you have a specific grievance, you're welcome to submit it in writing." I wasn't about to let her dismiss me so easily. "I've already done that," I replied, holding up a copy of the letter I had sent. "What I'm asking for now is transparency. If these rules are truly for the community's benefit, why not involve us in the decision-making process?" The room erupted into murmurs of agreement, and before Susan could respond, another neighbor stood up. It was Mrs. Patel. "Elizabeth's right," she said, her voice firm. "We've been living under these arbitrary rules for too long. It's time we had a say." One by one, Others began to speak up, sharing their own grievances and frustrations. It became clear that I wasn't the only one who felt Susan had overstepped her authority. The meeting stretched late into the evening, with neighbors demanding a review of the HOA's policies and greater accountability from the board. By the end of the night, the board had no choice but to agree to a community-wide vote on the fence color policy and other contested rules. It was a small victory, but it felt monumental. In the days that followed, the atmosphere in the neighborhood began to shift. Neighbors who had once been wary of speaking out started connecting with each other, forming a united front against the HOA's overreach. As for my fence, it remained white, standing tall as a symbol of resilience and community spirit. While the final vote was still weeks away, I felt a sense of pride knowing that I had sparked a movement for change. My fence wasn't just a personal victory. It was a reminder that sometimes, standing up for what you believe in can inspire others to do the same.